From the Hargrove House to script rewrite. In the hill country of western Pennsylvania, there remains a house that locals have long since abandoned trying to explain. Constructed in 1847 by a man whose name appears on no church registry, no census record prior to that year, and no deed of land purchase. Because according to county records, the land was simply already his. 3 families occupied that house between 1847 and 1901. Each departed without warning, not fleeing, not evicted, leaving as though they had come to some private understanding with the structure itself. They gathered what they could carry in the dark hours preceding dawn, and never came back for what remained. The final family to abandon it left a meal still on the table, a Bible open to Exodus, and every door in the house standing wide open, except one, the attic door. When a county assessor finally gained entry to the property in the spring of 1902, he recorded what he discovered in a report that was filed, stamped, and quietly withdrawn from the public ledger within 60 days of its submission. What he found in that attic, and more precisely, what he found beneath it, had been waiting there since before the first family ever moved in. Before we proceed with the story of the Hargrove House and the floor that should not have existed, take a moment right now to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. This community stretches across the country, and we want to know where you are. The hills west of Allegheny City in the 1840s were not the wilderness that Eastern newspapers liked to portray. The region had been settled for nearly 3 generations by that point. Its valleys carved into working farms, its creek beds lined with the sawmills and tanneries that sustained the timber economy. Small communities had formed around crossroads and ferry landings, each with its church, its tavern, its post road rutted deep by wagon wheels, and its particular hierarchy of men who owned things and men who worked for the men who owned things. It was a landscape that had learned to appear ordinary, to present itself as exactly what it seemed to be. No more, no less. That quality of enforced ordinariness was not merely geographic, it was social. The communities of western Pennsylvania in this period were built on a strict architecture of appearances. What you showed the world was who you were. What you kept from the world was your own concern, provided you kept it completely. The county seat for this region sat at the end of a 12-mile road that turned to mud each November and remained mud until April, which meant that in practical terms, the communities along Bracknell Ridge and its neighboring hollows governed themselves for 6 months of every year. The justice of the peace, the church elders, the mill owners, these were the instruments of order, and they operated with the confidence of men who understood that the county was largely theoretical at certain times of year and in certain conditions of weather. Into this self-sufficient, inward-facing world, where everyone's business was everyone else's business, where the arrival of a stranger was an event sufficient to occupy the community's conversational energies for weeks, the man who called himself Cornelius Vane arrived in October of 1847 and presented himself as the owner of 40 acres on the east face of Bracknell Ridge. He was recorded by the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Claiborne Township, a Reverend Amos Seal, as a man of perhaps 50 years, spare in build, with gray, streaked hair worn longer than the fashion, and an accent that the pastor described in his private journal as suggesting neither Pennsylvania nor any of the eastern states. Somewhere farther south, he thought, or perhaps a region entirely outside his experience. Vane carried a single trunk and arrived on foot from the direction of the Pittsburgh Road, though no one in Claiborne remembered seeing him pass through the town itself, which sat squarely on the only road from Pittsburgh that reached this part of the ridge country, and which had a tavern at its crossroads. That was the natural stopping place for any traveler coming from that direction. He paid for 3 nights at the tavern boarding house in hard currency, silver $50 of a date, that the boarding house keeper later told neighbors he had not seen in common circulation. And on the 2nd day of his stay, he walked to the county clerk's office and produced documents establishing his ownership of the Brackner Ridge parcel. The documents were examined by the clerk on duty, a man named Hosea Crabtree, who had handled deed transfers in Claiborne Township for 19 years. Crabtree found them to be in apparent order. The deed was correctly formatted, correctly witnessed, correctly stamped with what appeared to be the seal of the relevant court of record, and bore a chain of title that Crabtree described to a colleague the following day as plausible but unusual. Plausible in that each transfer of ownership was properly documented. Unusual in that the chain ran back only 4 transactions to an original grant that predated statehood, and that Crabtree had no means to verify against any records in his office. He noted his reservations in his ledger, but recorded the transfer as his function required him to do when presented with documents that appeared facially valid. He told his colleague, "I cannot say the papers are wrong. I can say only that they tell a story I cannot check." Within 6 weeks, a house stood on the Vane property. This fact alone should have generated considerable conversation, because 6 weeks was not sufficient time for a man working alone, or even with a capable hired crew, to construct a 2-story timber framed dwelling of the kind that materialized on Brackner Ridge. Neighbors who passed on the lower road and took the short detour up the ridge track to observe the progress of construction reported hearing sounds of work at all hours, including well before dawn and long after dark, which in late October and November meant in temperatures that made outdoor work not merely uncomfortable, but actively dangerous. The sounds were those of carpentry hammer, saw, the rhythmic thud of a timber beetle driving pegs, not the sounds of a large crew, but of 1 or 2 workers at most, moving without apparent pause through the shortest days of the year. When Jeremiah Ott, a man who ran the nearest farm at the base of the ridge, rode up the track to introduce himself in the 3rd week of November, he found the house not only structurally complete, but furnished, curtains in the windows, a kitchen garden already turned for winter, the soil banked over with straw in the manner of a careful farmer who expected to return to it in spring, firewood stacked to the eaves of a woodshed that also, somehow, was already built and roofed, and Cornelius Vane sitting on the porch in the November cold without a coat, reading something that he closed and set face down on the porch rail before Ott could see the cover. Vane received him with courtesy. He offered nothing to drink, though the season and the custom of the region would have suggested, at minimum, a cup of something warm. He answered questions about his past with answers that technically responded to what was asked without conveying anything of substance. Had come from a distance, had business interests in the region, had found the ridge parcel suitable to his purposes, intended to stay. He asked Ott nothing in return, which Ott noted was peculiar, because every man newly settled on a piece of land had practical questions about his neighbors, the nearest mill, the condition of the roads in winter, the reliability of the creek in dry season. Vane asked none of these things, as if he already knew the answers, and bade him good afternoon after approximately 20 minutes with the manner of a man concluding a formal appointment rather than a neighborly call. Ott rode home with the unsettling conviction that he had been assessed rather than visited, and that Vane had wanted to see him, had perhaps been expecting him, and having seen what he came to see, was finished with the encounter. The house itself, as Ott described it to his wife that evening, and as others who later gained access to it confirmed, was a capable piece of construction. Solid, well-fitted, nothing ostentatious. 2 stories, 4 rooms on the ground floor, including a kitchen with a substantial hearth. A steep staircase at the back of the main hall, and above it all, an attic that ran the full length of the building under a sharply pitched roof. The attic was accessed from a door at the top of the rear staircase and had 4 small windows, 2 at each gable end, which let in enough light on clear days to work by without a lamp. What distinguished the house from every other dwelling on Bracknell Ridge, and what those first observers did not yet have reason to examine carefully, was the flooring. The ground floor used wide chestnut planks, perhaps 18 inches across, the kind of first-growth timber that was becoming harder to find even in the 1840s, but was still available from the larger mills in the region. The second floor used narrower oak boards, also typical for the period and region. But the attic floor was something else. Those who eventually got close enough to examine it described a close-fitted tongue and groove hardwood of a species no one in Claiborne Township could readily identify. Not oak, not chestnut, not walnut, not cherry, not any of the familiar woods of the Pennsylvania forests. It was very pale, almost cream-colored when the light hit it, with a fine, nearly invisible grain, and it had been laid with a precision that the millwright Roland Pecha, who came later, would describe as the finest example of finished carpentry he had seen in a domestic building anywhere in western Pennsylvania. The boards were fitted so tightly that no light passed between them. No air moved through them, and the surface was as level as a tabletop across the full 30-foot length and 15-foot width of the attic. Cornelius Vane lived on Bracknell Ridge for 4 years. In that time, he purchased nothing from the local merchants beyond occasional quantities of lamp oil and dried provisions. He kept no livestock that any neighbor ever observed. He cultivated the kitchen garden in spring and summer with quiet efficiency. He attended no church, joined no fraternal organization, subscribed to no newspaper, and sent and received mail only twice in 4 years. Both times receiving packages from Pittsburgh that the postmaster described as heavy for their size and sealed in a manner he had not seen before. The outer wrapping secured with a cord tied in a specific knot that the postmaster's wife, who had grown up on the coast of Maine and knew something about rope work, said was used by navigators and surveyors, not by merchants or ordinary men of business. Vane received, in 4 years, a total of 3 visitors. All 3 arrived on foot from the Pittsburgh direction. All 3 stayed between 1 and 3 days. All 3 departed in the early morning hours before the rest of the community was stirring. Reverend Seal, who noted each of these visits in his journal, now wrote that the 3 visitors shared what he called a quality of practiced inconspicuousness. People who had trained themselves to take up as little space in the world as possible, to make no impression, to be forgotten almost in the act of being observed. He found this quality, in the context of visits to a man who himself possessed it, to be more alarming than any more visible strangeness would have been. In the spring of 1851, Cornelius Vane was gone. He gave no notice. He transacted no sale. He filed no departure with any public office. The house on Bracknell Ridge stood empty for 11 months, the kitchen garden going to weed, the firewood slowly consumed by no fire, the curtains fading behind their windows. During those 11 months, various members of the community found reasons to approach the house, and at least 2 of them, according to later accounts, went inside. Neither reported finding anything missing from what they could see of the furnished rooms below. Neither admitted, at the time, to having gone to the attic. The house had the quality, according to one woman, who had entered it on the pretext of checking whether the owner might be ill, of a place that had simply been paused, not abandoned, but set aside, the way one sets aside a task that will be returned to. It was the community's collective assumption, never formally stated but clearly operative, that Vane would come back, that whatever had taken him away would conclude, and he would return and resume his quiet, self-contained existence on the ridge. This assumption held until November of 1851, when the first substantial snow of the season fell, and it became clear that no one had banked the pipes or shuttered the windows or done any of the things a man does when he prepares a house for winter absence. At that point, the assumption shifted, and what replaced it was the somewhat different and more unsettling proposition that Vane had not gone somewhere, but had simply ceased to be a presence in the landscape, ceased to require the physical fact of the house. As if he and the building had each served their purpose to the other, and had released each other by mutual agreement. Into this vacancy, in the autumn of 1861, came the Pecha family. Roland Pecha had been trained as a millwright in Chester County, and had done well enough in that trade for a decade before a combination of circumstances. A mill fire, a bad investment, a partner who proved dishonest, had reduced him to the category of man who needed a free house more than he needed the story attached to it. He filed for possession under the squatter statutes then in effect, and moved his family in on a February morning, when the snow was still deep enough on the Bracknell Ridge, track to make the wagon wheels cut down to the frozen mud beneath. His wife, Arlene, who kept a household journal of the kind that educated women of her class and background typically maintained, recorded the arrival in her usual methodical way. The state of the house, which was structurally sound but cold and in need of thorough cleaning. The quality of the land, which she assessed as better than the ridge's reputation suggested. The nature of the community they were joining, which she found reserved but not unfriendly. And she recorded her first impression of the attic in the same entry, noting that she went up to assess the storage situation and found the floor unlike any she had seen in a house of this type. Pale and closely fitted, with a smoothness that seemed to her more like a piece of furniture than a floor, more like the surface of something built with a specific purpose than the utilitarian boarding she expected. Roland Pecha's reaction to the attic floor was the reaction of a craftsman, immediate professional interest, followed by a conclusion he stated with the confidence of expertise. The floor was the finest work he had seen in a residential building. Full stop. He estimated it had been laid by someone whose skill was entirely outside the normal range of rural Pennsylvania carpentry, and who had used a wood he could not identify from any of the species he knew from 2 decades of millwork. He tried to find the join between boards with the blade of his folding knife, and could not. He estimated the thickness of the boards at somewhat greater than standard, which was consistent with a floor designed for heavy use or for the specific property of sound absorption. A well-fitted floor of this thickness would, he noted, be nearly soundproof, which was an unusual feature in an attic that served no obvious purpose requiring soundproofing. He noted all of this to Arlene, and then, characteristically, set it aside as a practical matter resolved. The floor was excellent, which was a benefit, and its origins were none of his concern. Arlene Pecha was not so easily satisfied. She was the daughter of a Quaker family from Chester County, educated beyond the regional average, and by temperament disposed to examine things from multiple angles before settling on an explanation. In the early weeks of the family's occupation of the Bracknell Ridge house, she went to the attic several times for ordinary purposes, Storage. Retrieval, the seasonal rotation of household goods, and each time she noticed the same thing. It was not a sound. It was not a sight. It was a sensation beneath her feet, persistent and difficult to describe, that the floor was not simply the topmost surface of the building's uppermost story, but was instead a kind of boundary. A surface with something beneath it that gave it a quality of weight and resistance different from what a floor over open air produces. A floor over empty attic joists has a slight resonance, a faint hollowness that even someone without Roland's professional training learns to feel underfoot after years of walking on such floors. This floor had the opposite quality to density, a downward solidity, as if it were resting not on the building's frame, but on something that came from below. She mentioned this to Roland in November of 1852, framing it as carefully as she could in practical terms, because she knew him well enough to understand that anything framed as intuition would be dismissed before it was considered. She described the sensation she felt underfoot. She described the quality of the sound when she pressed her heel against the boards. Not the expected hollow resonance, but something closer, denser, suggestive of mass beneath rather than air. Roland listened. He went up with a lamp that evening, spent a methodical 40 minutes on the attic floor pressing and listening and knocking, and came down to tell her that the floor was solid, the boards well fitted, and that whatever she was feeling was almost certainly the timber settling in the cold, which produced sounds and sensations that could be misinterpreted. He said all of this with the confidence of expertise, and then he did not go back to the attic for the remainder of that winter. Not once. Arlene noted this in her journal without comment. She understood that the absence of comment was itself the comment. The months that followed produced a series of entries in Arlene's journal that circle back to the attic with a regularity she seems to find as puzzling as its object. She is not a woman given to obsession or anxiety, and her other journal entries from the same period are models of practical domesticity. The state of the garden, the cost of provisions, her daughter's progress with their studies, community events, letters to and from family in Chester County. These entries are orderly and grounded. The entries that concern the attic have a different quality, not frightened, not fanciful, but straining, as if she is trying to fit something she knows into a vocabulary that does not quite contain it. She writes in January of 1853, "I understand that Roland is right about the floor. I understand that the sounds and sensations I notice there have explanations that a man who knows wood would find obvious." And yet she leaves the sentence there. The next entry is 3 days later and concerns the price of salt pork. She returns to the attic in April of 1853, but this time with a specific purpose. She wants to measure the distance from the attic floor to the ceiling of the room below and compare it to the corresponding measurement taken from outside the building. The distance from the eave line to the window tops of the second-story rooms. She does not record what prompted this idea. She takes her measurements carefully and records them in her journal with the precision of someone who has learned to trust numbers over impressions. The external measurement gives her approximately 9 feet of attic space between the floor and the ridge beam. The internal measurement, taken by lowering a plumb line from a nail in the attic floor through the gap around the staircase opening to a point level with the second-story ceiling, gives her approximately 6 feet. She checks both measurements twice, and they are consistent. She has 3 feet of attic floor, that by the measurement of the building's exterior should not be there. She shows these measurements to Roland. He examines them, rechecks them himself, and offers an explanation. The attic floor has been built up on a substantial subfloor, or sleeper system, which is unusual but not unheard of in buildings, where the owner wanted an extremely solid, level attic surface. He says this with less confidence than his usual pronouncements, and he goes up to the attic that afternoon with his measuring rod and spends more than an hour this time. When he comes down, he tells Arlene that the subfloor explanation does not account for the full discrepancy. There is, he tells her, approximately 18 inches that he cannot account for structurally, space that by the outside measurement of the building exists, but that the internal structure does not acknowledge. He tells her this, then he is quiet for a long time. Then he says, "It is possible that the floor is not built up from inside the attic. It is possible that it was built down from something else." What he means by this, what Arlene understood him to mean based on the way she records this conversation and the silence that followed it, is that the attic floor might not be the floor of the attic at all. It might be the ceiling of something else. Something that occupies the space between the attic's apparent floor and the actual structure of the building. Something that enters from below rather than from above. Roland Pesci, millwright, practical man, a person who had spent his professional life in the concrete world of board feet and load-bearing joists and the physics of wood under stress, sat at his kitchen table in the spring of 1853 and said to his wife, in so many words, "I think the house was built around a room that was already there." The following August, he broke one of the boards. He had carried a heavy storage trunk up to the attic, and it slipped from his grip as he maneuvered it through the low attic door. And the iron, bound corner struck the pale floor with force enough to split one board at the edge and lift it fractionally from its neighbor. The gap this produced was narrow, no more than an inch, and he replaced the trunk over it immediately. But in the moment before he did, he had held the lamp down to the gap and seen what was below. Not the underside of a subfloor, not the darkness of a standard structural void. Steps, stone steps descending, cut from single pieces of stone. The treads worn slightly in the center in the way that stone wears under the passage of feet over long periods of time. The walls visible in that brief lamplight were cut stone as well, fitted without mortar in the manner of construction far older than anything a man building a house in western Pennsylvania in 1847 would normally employ. Roland Pesci replaced the trunk over the cracked board, went downstairs, and told his wife to begin preparing for a move in the spring. He told her the board had cracked, and he had seen a structural void beneath it that needed addressing. He did not tell her what he had actually seen. He did not tell her why a structural void would require them to leave rather than repair. He told her nothing more about the attic for the remainder of their time in the house, which was not much time. They were gone by April of 1855, loading their wagon in the gray before dawn of a morning that Arlene described in the last full entry of her journal as cold and still and smelling of the previous autumn's leaves, as if winter had held them so long in that place that even the seasons were confused about when it was time to let things go. Arlene's journal ends mid-sentence on the night before their departure. The final complete sentence reads, "Roland says we are not running. Roland says there is nothing to run from." The sentence after that breaks off after 4 words, but the floor is. The remaining pages of the journal are blank. The house stood empty for 6 years. During those 6 years, it became what empty houses in rural communities always become, a subject of speculation, a location where teenage courage was tested on autumn nights, a repository for whatever stories the community needed to attach to a place that no one fully understood. The stories that grew around the Brackner Ridge house, during this period were notable for their restraint. The people of Claiborne Township were not prone to elaborate ghost narratives, and the relatively recent memory of the Petcha family's departure, people who had lived in the house for 3 years and left abruptly without explanation, was too close and too concrete to require embellishment. What circulated in the community was more specific than ghost stories. There was something under the house. Cornelius Vane had put it there, or had found it there, or had built the house to keep people from asking about it. The Petcha family had discovered what it was. And whatever it was sufficient to persuade a capable, practical man like Roland Petchy to leave a sound, weatherproof, rent-free house rather than remain in it. It is worth pausing here to note something about the stories that did not attach themselves to the Bracknell Ridge house. During these 6 years, there were no reports of lights, sounds, or apparitions associated with the empty building. No animals refused to approach it. No children told stories of figures seen in the windows. The house's reputation was not of the haunted kind. The kind generated by fear of the uncanny. It was of a different, and in some ways more durable kind. The reputation of a place that was known to contain something specifically and concretely that people had decided was better not to investigate. The distinction matters. Haunted places invite the brave and the curious because the stories attached to them are understood to be stories, and a certain kind of person is drawn to test that understanding. A place known to contain something real does not invite that kind of curiosity. It invites avoidance, or it invites the particular determined appetite of the person who has decided that knowing is worth whatever knowing costs. The Hargrove family belonged to neither of these categories. They were practical, economically depressed, and in possession of the specific kind of optimism that attaches itself to people who have been unlucky long enough to start discounting warnings as the luxury of people who have not been unlucky. Silas Hargrove was a former blacksmith who had lost 2 fingers in his forge in the same accident, and had been looking since then for the kind of stable, low-cost existence that would let him and his family regain some kind of footing. His wife, Constance, was a determined woman from a farming family in Ohio who had married Silas when they were both young enough to believe that determination and hard work would suffice. Their son, Derry, was 14 when the family arrived at Bracknell Ridge in October of 1861, 1 month into the Civil War, old enough to understand that his father was a man reduced from what he had been, and young enough to believe that the reduction was reversible. They arrived on a clear October afternoon with the leaves at their peak and the ridge country showing itself at its most persuasive. The house was sound. The kitchen garden had gone to volunteer growth in the 6 empty years, but the soil was good. The woodshed had collapsed on one side, but was repairable. Silas walked through every room on the ground floor and the second story, tested the joists, examined the framing where it was visible, pressed his hand against the interior walls, and nodded at what he found. He went up to the attic and spent perhaps 10 minutes there before coming back down. He told Constance, "The floor up there is the finest work I've seen in a house of this class. I don't know what it is, but it's right. Whatever else is wrong with this place, somebody knew what they were doing with that floor." What Silas did not tell Constance, what he told no one for 9 years, was that he had, on that first day in the attic, noticed an irregularity. One board near the north wall was sitting proud of its neighbors by perhaps 1/4 of an inch. The irregularity was subtle enough that most people would not have noticed it. And even those who noticed, it would likely have attributed it to seasonal movement in the wood. Silas noticed it because he had spent years working with metal And metal teaches you to read tolerance the way carpenters read grade grain. To feel the difference between a surface that is flat and a surface that is almost flat but isn't. And to understand that the difference between those two things is never accidental in precision work. He knelt down and pressed the proud board flat with the heel of his hand, applying gradual downward pressure, and felt it give. Not spring back as a swelled board gives, but compress with a soft mechanical resistance and produce, when at the bottom of its travel, a faint but distinct click like the engagement of a latch. The section of floor that responded to this, larger than the board he had pressed, a rectangle of perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet centered on the north wall, and including the board he had touched and 5 others around it, rose silently on concealed hinges. The whole section pivoting upward as a single unit, counterbalanced by some mechanism he could not immediately see, to reveal beneath it a stone staircase descending into darkness. The staircase was cut from single large stones. The walls framing it were cut and fitted stone, dry, laid without mortar, in a technique that Silas associated with construction older than anything he knew in western Pennsylvania. He stood at the top of the stairs for a long moment, breathing the air that rose from below, which was dry and faintly cool, and carried the smell of stone and something else he could not identify. Not decay, not must, but a kind of mineral stillness, as if the air below had been sealed in for a long time and had forgotten how to move. Then he went back downstairs, found a lamp, lit it, and went back up. The chamber at the bottom of the 12 stone steps was 30 feet long and perhaps 15 feet wide, running north to south beneath the full length of the attic above. The walls were cut stone, the same dry, laid technique as the staircase, fitted with a precision that spoke of either extraordinary skill or extraordinary time, or both. The floor was packed earth, compressed to the density of stone by what must have been decades or centuries of compression. The ceiling, the underside of the attic floor, was the extraordinary fitted hardwood viewed from below, smooth and seamless from this angle as well, with the mechanism of the concealed hatch visible as a single iron rod running horizontally along the north wall, connected by a simple linkage to the counterbalanced hinges. The mechanism was elegant in the way that very old, very well made things are elegant. No excess, no decoration, each element performing its function with the minimum of material and the maximum of result. The chamber was not empty. Along the eastern wall, built directly into the cut stone, were a series of wooden shelves, deep, well constructed, fitted to the wall in a manner that made them appear as much part of the structure as the stone itself. The wood of the shelves was the same pale, unidentifiable species as the attic floor above. On these shelves were objects. Silas moved the lamp slowly along the row, taking his time, committing what he saw to memory with the care of a man who sensed that this was the only reliable record he was going to make. There were boxes, flat, document-sized, made of the same pale wood as the shelves, sealed at their seams with dark wax. He did not count them precisely. Later, he would estimate between 20 and 30, arranged in 2 rows on the deepest shelves, with spaces between groups that suggested either an original organizational scheme or the removal of some boxes at some previous time. There was a leather case of the kind that a surveyor or cartographer would use for rolled documents or maps, with the leather treated with something that had preserved against the dry air of the chamber better than untreated leather would have managed. There were 3 lanterns of a design he had not encountered before, elegant, clearly expensive, with reservoirs of what proved, when he tested the stopper of one, to still be oil, thick and dark, but not degraded, the wick intact. There was a chest against the west wall, Iron, banded and iron-locked, the iron showing only the faintest surface rust. The lock of a quality that made the iron chest at the county clerk's office look like a child's toy. And along the southern wall, arranged in a careful row on the packed earth floor itself, were 11 objects, each one wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with cord at both ends, each one approximately the size and weight of a ledger book. And the seal on the wax that bound the cloth wrapping of the nearest object was pressed into the wax with a stamp of some kind, leaving an impression of a circle divided into 3 equal sections, each section containing a symbol. Silas looked at the symbols for a long time. He did not recognize them as letters from any alphabet he knew. Not English, not the German script of the Pennsylvania Dutch communities, not anything he could place. He thought about this. He thought about the dry, perfectly preserved air of the chamber, the lantern still full of oil, the wax seals intact across all 11 objects and all the boxes on the shelves. He thought about the stone walls, and the mechanism in the ceiling, and the house built above it, built around it, built to cover it by a man who had arrived from nowhere with ownership papers that could not be verified and who had disappeared 4 years later, as quietly as he had appeared. He thought about all of this, and he made the decision that would govern his relationship to the Brackner Ridge House for the next 9 years. He would touch nothing. He would say nothing. He would go back upstairs, engage the mechanism, and live in the house as if the chamber did not exist. He told himself this was prudent. He told himself he was a man with a crippled hand, an ailing wife, and a son not yet old enough to be useful, and that whatever was in that chamber was either dangerous or valuable, or both, and that the intersection of those qualities with the circumstances of a man like himself was unlikely to produce any outcome he would want. He told himself in the language of the practical man. He understood himself to be that he had found something that did not belong to him, and that the correct course of action was to leave it where it was. He told himself all of this, and it was true. It was all true. And he also knew, in the part of himself that was more honest than his reasoning, that what had stopped him from touching anything in that chamber was something simpler and more fundamental than calculation. It was the feeling, standing in the lamplight among the sealed boxes and the wrapped ledgers and the silent iron chest, that the objects in that room knew he was there. Not in any supernatural sense. Silas was not a man for supernatural senses, but in the sense that objects arranged with deliberate care in a preserved space carry the intention of the person who arranged them, and that intention in this case communicated itself to him with perfect clarity. These things were placed here to wait, and the person who placed them chose carefully who would wait with them. And that person was not Silas Hargrove. He engaged the mechanism and went downstairs. He never told Constance. He never, in 9 years of living with it, stopped asking himself whether that was right. Constance died in the winter of 1868 of a fever that took hold and let go slow. And in the weeks of her illness and the months after it, the question of what she had not known about the attic of the house she had lived in for 7 years acquired a weight that Silas carried in addition to the ordinary weight of grief. He did not go back to the chamber. He did not tell anyone. He stayed. What kept him there? In a house he could have left at any time, in a community he owed nothing to, with a secret beneath his feet that had cost him his wife's full knowledge of her own home. What kept Silas Hargrove on Brackner Ridge for 9 years after his discovery is a question his son put to him directly on the evening in 1870, when Silas finally spoke. Derry was 23, married to a woman named Lucette from a farming family in Westmoreland County, and beginning to understand that his father's health was failing and that the questions he did not ask now would not be answerable later. He put the question plainly, "Why did you stay?" Silas thought about this for a while and then said, "I stayed because leaving felt like trespassing, like I would be taking something with me that I hadn't been given." He paused and then said something that Derry recorded verbatim in his later letter to his cousin in Ohio. "The room is not finished with its business. I could feel that as clearly as I can feel the cold. Whatever they put down there, whoever they were, it isn't done yet, and I'm not the one to interfere with it." Derry Hargrove listened to everything his father told him that evening. He asked his questions, received his answers, and then waited 3 days before going up to the attic himself. He did not tell Lucette where he was going. He found the mechanism on the first try because his father had described its location precisely. He went down. His subsequent letter to his cousin in Ohio, a cousin named James Hargrove, who worked as a clerk in Cincinnati and who was apparently the person Derry trusted most with what he had discovered, was written 4 months after this descent from an address in Cincinnati, which tells us that the family had already moved by the time Derry composed it. The letter is preserved in the Cincinnati archive that received James Hargrove's papers from his widow's estate, and it has the quality of something composed by a person exercising extreme discipline over both his vocabulary and his emotions. The early parts of the letter confirm his father's description of the chamber. In every particular, the stone walls, the shelves, the sealed boxes, the 3 lanterns with their oil intact, the leather map case, the iron-banded chest, the leaven-wrapped objects along the southern wall. Nothing, as far as he could determine, had been disturbed since his father's visit 9 years before. The preservation was, if anything, more remarkable to Derry than it had been to Silas, because Derry was old enough to have a clearer sense of what 9 years of undisturbed storage in a sealed space does to organic materials, and what the chamber preserved was not what should have survived. Unlike his father, Derry opened one of the flat wooden boxes. He chose one at random from the middle of the lower row on the eastern shelves, unworking the wax seal carefully to avoid breaking it more than necessary. He intended, he wrote, to reseal it after reading, though he did not explain why this mattered to him, and it is one of several details in the letter where his reasoning is opaque in ways that suggest he is omitting something he chose not to commit to paper. The box contained documents, multiple sheets of the paper he described as thin as a banknote but more durable, written in a hand so uniform and precise that he initially mistook it for printing. He read English. The documents were in English, clearly composed by someone for whom English was their primary language of formal communication. He read enough to understand the nature of the documents. Then he replaced them in the box, pressed the wax seal back as well as he could manage, returned the box to its position on the shelf, and went back up the stairs without examining anything else. In the letter to his cousin, he does not transcribe what he read. He says, "I will not write the details here, James. Not because I don't trust you, but because I don't trust paper." He says the documents concern names, a very large number of names, more than he could count in the pages he saw from one box alone. Against each name there are dates, locations, and figures that he took at first to be monetary amounts. Though now he is not certain they are monetary. He says the locations range far beyond what he expected, beyond Pennsylvania, beyond the eastern states, into regions he could identify and regions he could not. He says the dates run back, beyond what anyone living could remember, and run forward to within the past few years, which should be impossible for a document sealed in a chamber that he has no reason to believe has been entered since his father found it. And yet the forward dates are there, and the ink that records them is the same throughout without any variation in color or character that would suggest later additions. And then he writes the sentence that he crosses out twice and reconstructs the third time. Among the names in the documents that I read, there were names I recognized. He does not specify whose names. He does not explain how he recognized them. He says only, "I recognized them, and the recognition was not a comfort." The Hargrove family, Silas Derry and Lucette, left the Bracknell Ridge house before the end of that summer. They left the way all families left quickly, with what they could carry, and in the hours before the community was awake. Silas died in Cincinnati in 1873, 3 years after leaving the only home he had occupied for most of his adult life. Derry continued corresponding with his cousin for a decade after the Cincinnati letter, but never returned to the subject of the chamber or its contents. Lucette outlived them both. In the spring of 1904, a Pittsburgh Dispatch correspondent named Harlan Voss was working on a series of articles about abandoned properties in western Pennsylvania, a subject that had acquired renewed public interest after the industrialization of the region had left a scatter of emptied farm properties on farm properties in the wake of the population's movement toward the mill towns. Voss tracked down Lucette Hargrove, then in her 70s, living with a daughter's family in a suburb of Pittsburgh, and asked her about the house on Bracknell Ridge, which had by then been demolished. Lucette granted him one interview. Voss's article, which ran in the Dispatch in May of 1904, quotes her sparingly. She says that she never went to the attic of the Bracknell Ridge house and never asked her husband what he found there. She says, "I knew he had found something. I knew it from the first week." A woman knows when her husband is carrying something that isn't hers to share. I made my peace with not knowing. Voss notes in the published article that Mrs. Hargrove, when speaking of the house, appeared not frightened, but relieved, as if the question had been put to her in a form she could answer without saying anything real. Lucette died in 1907. No other member of the Hargrove family left any account of the Bracknell Ridge house. Now we arrive at the county assessor, and at the moment when the machinery of institutional management becomes briefly and imperfectly visible. His name was Ezekiel Morrow, and he had spent 20 years documenting properties for Allegheny County with the methodical temperament of a man who believed that accurate records were the foundation of civil society, and that the production of accurate records was therefore a form of civic virtue. He had seen in those 20 years the full range of what people build, store, abandon, and conceal, and he had developed a professional practice of treating what he found with the equanimity appropriate to his function. His job was to document, not to judge. He arrived at the Bracknell Ridge property in April of 1902, authorized by the county to assess the estate of the property's most recent registered owner, who had died without heirs, and to determine its disposition. He entered the house and conducted his examination floor by floor, room by room, with the thoroughness his professional reputation required. He reached the attic in the afternoon of his second day. He found the mechanism on his first careful examination of the floor. It took him longer than it had taken Silas Hargrove, because he was approaching an unfamiliar surface, without prior knowledge. But the proud board near the north wall was visible to a careful observer, and Morrow was a careful observer. He triggered the mechanism. He went downstairs for a lamp. He descended. His written report, filed with the county clerk's office on April 29, 1902, ran to 31 pages. And this was extraordinary. A routine property assessment in Allegheny County in this period ran to 4 or 5 pages. The additional 26 pages of Morrow's report accounted for the chamber, its contents, their condition, and his professional observations about the construction of both the chamber and the concealment mechanism above it. He was specific. He inventoried the objects on the shelves and the floor in the same detail and with the same calm, professional language he would have used to inventory any property. He noted the condition of each category of object. He noted his assessment of the chamber's construction date, which he placed significantly earlier than the house above it. He estimated the chamber was at least a century older than the 1847 house. Based on the stonework techniques and the degree of compaction of the earthen floor, he noted the seal on the wax of the 11 cloth, wrapped objects and described it in terms precise enough to constitute a useful identification. A circle of approximately 1 inch in diameter, divided into 3 equal sectors, by lines running from the circumference to the center, each sector containing a single symbol that he reproduced by hand, drawing in the margin of his report. He noted that he had seen this seal before in a different context, and that recognition was part of what he considered his professional obligation to report. He filed the report. He received the standard receipt. He went home to his house in Allegheny City and sat at his writing desk and composed a letter to his brother-in-law in Philadelphia, a man named Theodore Dunning, who worked in the law and who was, as far as Morrow was concerned, the most reliable person he could think of to trust with what he had seen. In the letter, which Morrow evidently wrote the same evening, he returned from the property. He describes the chamber and its contents in summary. Not the full inventory of the report, but enough to convey the nature and significance of the discovery. He describes the seal. He describes his prior encounter with the seal, which he is careful to frame in terms that acknowledge it without specifying the context. He had seen it on a document that had come through his office in an official capacity 7 years prior, in connection with a matter that had been referred upward for resolution, and that he had subsequently not been asked to follow up on. He had noted the seal at the time, and had not found a match for it in any reference he consulted. Seeing it again in the chamber beneath the Brackner Ridge house, he wrote, confirmed for him that what he had found was not an isolated historical curiosity, but was connected to something ongoing, something that had people, and that those people moved documents and property and presumably information in patterns that were not visible to the normal instruments of county governance. He told Dunning that he had reported everything in his official document, and that he expected the matter to be referred to appropriate authorities, and that he was writing this letter because he wanted someone outside the county government to know what he had found before any referral took place. He did not say that he was worried about the referral. He did not need to. Morrow's report was stamped received on April 29, 1902. It remained in the active file of the county clerk's office for 62 days. On June 30, 1902, it was removed from the active file and placed in a category designated in the clerk's internal system as pending resolution. Over the following 12 years, it was transferred twice between offices and ultimately appears in an inventory of materials transferred to the State Archive in Harrisburg in 1914. When researchers sought it in the 1940s, the 1960s, and again in 2003, the most recent search, conducted by a historian of Allegheny County land records who had encountered a reference to the report in a secondary source and requested it by its original reference number. It was not present in the archive, and the archive's response to the 2003 request stated that no record matching the reference number had been received from any transferring office. On May 12, 1902, 13 days after Morrow filed his report, 49 days before it was removed from the active file. A farmhand employed on what had by then become the Ott grandson's operation at the base of Bracknell Ridge observed 3 men arriving at the Vane house property in a hired wagon from the Pittsburgh direction. He observed them entering the house, and he observed the wagon being loaded that evening with a number of large wooden crates that had arrived empty and departed heavy. He reported this to Reverend Aldous Crew, who recorded it in his parish journal that evening with characteristic precision. 3 men, unknown, wagon hired from Pittsburgh, arrived mid-morning, departed approximately 4 hours before sundown with crates of significant weight. Crew noted that the men had not stopped in the village, had not identified themselves to anyone, and had conducted their business at the Bracknell Ridge property with the speed and efficiency of people who knew exactly what they had come to do. Within 2 weeks of this observation, the Bracknell Ridge property changed hands in a transaction recorded at the county clerk's office, sold to a Pittsburgh businessman whose name appears in the deed, and nowhere else in any record that subsequent researchers have located. No business registration. No other property transaction, no correspondence, no mention in any Pittsburgh directory of the period. The house was demolished the following spring. Concrete was poured over the site. A dairy operation was established there in the 1910s and ran until the 1940s. The ridge is farmland now, unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other ridge in this part of western Pennsylvania. Ezekiel Morrow retired from the county clerk's office in 1906. He spent his remaining years in Shadyside, a quiet residential neighborhood of Pittsburgh, and died in January of 1921 at the age of 73. Theodore Dunning, his brother-in-law in Philadelphia, predeceased him by 6 years. The letter Morrow had written in May of 1902 was found by Dunning's widow among her husband's personal papers when she settled his estate after his death in 1915. She kept it in an envelope marked, "Personal, not to be opened before my death." Apparently following instructions Dunning had left her, and when she herself died in 1931, the envelope passed to a nephew who worked as a records clerk in Pittsburgh. The nephew read the letter, considered its contents for several days, and then placed it in a box with other family papers. He donated the box to a Pittsburgh historical organization in the 1950s as part of a general disposal of the estate's less obviously valuable materials. The letter sat in the organization's uncatalogued holdings for over 40 years before it was processed as part of a general inventory in 1997. It has been read, as far as the organization can determine, by 3 researchers. None of them has published anything about it. The question that runs through all of this, through Silas Hargrove's 9 years of silence and Derry Hargrove's letter that says everything, except the thing that mattered most, through Ezekiel Morrow's 31 pages removed to a place they have not been found since, is the question of what, specifically, was in that chamber. The documents, the sealed boxes, the wrapped ledgers, the leather map case, the iron, banded chest, all of it was carried out of the ridge on the evening of May 12, 1902, in crates loaded onto a wagon that returned to Pittsburgh and left no further trace. The chamber itself was poured full of concrete when the house above it was demolished. If anything remains beneath the foundation of what is now a working farm on the east face of Bracknell Ridge, no one has looked for it with the means to find it, and no one with obvious reason to look has appeared. The concrete was poured 62 years before Morrow's report was sought in the archive and found missing. And by the time anyone had reason to make that connection, the connection was as buried as the chamber. What the evidence allows us to say is this: Cornelius Vane did not build the chamber beneath the house. He built the house around a chamber that already existed. The chamber was cut from stone using techniques consistent with construction far older than 1847. The chamber was equipped with a mechanism for concealment that was already installed when Vane arrived, or that Vane installed when he built the house over it, as part of the same act of concealment. It was stocked with objects that were sealed for long-term preservation, and that included, among their contents, documents listing names and locations and figures across a range of dates that could not have been produced in a single historical moment. It was maintained across periods of apparent vacancy. By Vane's presence, then by the three families who lived above it and who, one by one, discovered it and chose silence, and then by whoever sent the three men with the wagon on the morning of May 12, 1902. The seal that closed the wax on the chamber's objects, the three-section circle with its three symbols, was a seal that a county assessor recognized from a previous official encounter 7 years before his visit to the chamber, which means it was a seal in active use in 1895 at minimum, and most likely later. No organization using that seal has been identified in any public record, fraternal register, commercial filing, or governmental index that researchers have consulted. These are the facts. The facts describe an infrastructure, not a building, not a family secret, not the idiosyncrasy of a single eccentric man, but an infrastructure, a system for storing, preserving, and eventually recovering information and material of a nature and importance that the people managing it had decided, over a period of decades and perhaps much longer, was better kept beneath a house in rural Pennsylvania than in any location accessible to the ordinary instruments of public record and institutional governance. The house was the container. The families were incidental. They were chosen or permitted or tolerated because they were unlikely, for economic or personal reasons, to disturb what was beneath them. And when one of them finally did more than discover the chamber, when Derry Hargrove opened a box and read names he recognized, the family was gone within months, and the house was in new hands within a year, and the contents of the chamber were in crates on a wagon heading back to wherever such things go when they are done being stored. What those names were, what Derry Hargrove recognized, and was afraid to commit to paper even in a letter he trusted to his most reliable cousin, remains in the only place it has been since the summer of 1870, inside an account that stops precisely where the accounting becomes specific. This is not an accident. It is the most deliberate thing in this entire story. The decision made independently by Silas Hargrove, by Derry Hargrove, and by Ezekiel Morrow to leave the content out. Silas touched nothing. Derry read and did not transcribe. Morrow described the chamber fully, but appears to have been careful in his letter to Dunning about how much of the document's content he reproduced. 3 different men in 3 different decades, confronted with the contents of the same chamber, arrived at the same decision about how much to say. That consistency is either a remarkable coincidence, or it is the most reliable evidence we have about what was down there. That whatever it was, each person who encountered it understood immediately that the correct response was silence. We are left, then, with a floor that did not match the house, and everything that floor was built to conceal. The attic of the Brackner Ridge house was built over a space that had been made to hold secrets, by people who had thought carefully about how long secrets needed to be held, and what conditions they needed to survive in. The house was built to service that need. The families were the last layer of concealment, the most human layer, the layer that required complicity, and that produced it in 3 cases out of 3 without any apparent coercion. No one threatened Silas Hargrove. No one threatened the Petcha family. No one threatened Ezekiel Morrow. They each encountered what was in that chamber and made, without instruction, the same choice. That tells us something about what they found. It does not tell us something reassuring. This mystery shows us, perhaps, something about the depth of certain silences, about the difference between a secret that is kept and a secret that keeps itself. The house on Bracknell Ridge was demolished more than a century ago. The ridge is quiet. The concrete has been there longer than anyone now. Living has been alive. And the documents with their names and their locations, and their figures across decades of dates, are wherever the Pittsburgh wagon took them, behind whatever institutional patience has been keeping them since. 3 researchers have read Morrow's letter and published nothing. Whatever is in that chamber's contents is still waiting for something. The way Silas Hargrove understood, standing in the lamplight of a December afternoon in 1861, that it had always been waiting. The question is not what the floor was hiding.